Good morning, everybody, and how are you all today? I hope you're doing very well. I'm doing fine. I think the biggest problem that I've got at the moment is coming up with ideas for these videos, but I have no problems ripping off the ideas of my friends. And this week, my mate Mujahid out in South Africa did a video all about the evolution of the landscape photographer. And so I thought what I would do is just copy him completely and do a video all about my evolution as a landscape photographer. Essentially what I'm going to be doing is talking about myself, which is my favourite subject after all. Now, if you haven't seen Mujahid's video, I do suggest you go and check it out when we've finished here. I'll leave a link in the description below. But for now, we're going to start at the very beginning of my photography journey. I think that's a great place to start. If I were some kind of groovy art house director, I may start in the middle and then jump back and then jump forward so that nobody has any idea what's going on at all. But no, for today, we're going to start at the beginning. And my journey started back in 2006. Now, that was a very important year for me. It was the year that I got married, and we spent a fortune on our wedding, most of which went on the honeymoon. Now, for the wedding, we actually had a proper professional photographer, but on the honeymoon, we wanted to try and catch some images that would be reminders of our time away. And I didn't know anything about photography, so I thought that was probably the best time for me to actually learn a little bit about how to take decent photographs. So if I was going to take photographs, obviously I'd need a camera. And this is the very first camera that I bought. This is a Canon EOS 350D, so it's an 8 megapixel crop sensor DSLR. And I bought this from Jessop's in Milton Keynes. And I used this pretty much exclusively until November 2011. And at the time, I shot everything on a tripod because that's what I thought you did in those days. Now, I came to landscape photography very, very early on in my journey. I've always had a love for the countryside and for the outdoors. I'm a real country boy at heart. I hate cities. I used to work in London in Canary Wharf, and I really hate the busyness and how crammed together everybody is. I much prefer being out in the countryside. And at the time I was living in Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, which is where I was born. I'm not originally from the Lake District. And I started by exploring areas like the Grand Union Canal and the reservoirs close to Marsworth. And that's probably where my love of shooting water comes from. But I also did quite a lot of photography in the Chiltern Hills and around the woods in Ashridge and Wendover and places like that. Probably one of the biggest events in my life came in 2010 when I moved from Buckinghamshire in England to just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. That was to start my job at Sky before I became a full-time photographer. I used to work in IT. And I had a brilliant, nearly 9 years at Sky. I really, really loved it. I was given so much opportunity. But around that time, I'd also acquired quite a lot of gear. I'd kind of made the mistake of thinking that having loads of gear would make me a better photographer. And I had a ton of lenses. I had a big, heavy tripod, loads of filters, big bag. And in reality, what I found was exactly the opposite. I wasn't a good enough photographer to be able to get the most out of all of that equipment. And I actually found that ultimately it was getting in the way of my photography. Now, what I did next is going to seem a little strange to some of you, but bear with me. What I did was I sold all my gear. This camera is the only thing that I have left from that time. I actually find it almost impossible to sell cameras. In fact, I've still got all the cameras I've ever owned. And I replaced all of that gear with this compact camera. This is a Canon S90. It's absolutely fantastic. So I got rid of all my gear and replaced it with a camera that I could fit in my pocket. And the reason I bought this was because at the time it was one of the only compact cameras that actually shot RAW. I learned a huge amount shooting with this little camera. It's quite basic. The only thing that I would ever really change is the focal length. It has a range of 28mm to 105mm. I used to shoot in aperture priority, set it to f8, and then just let it choose the shutter speed. And that allowed me to concentrate on what's really important, so that's composition and framing. Now, one of the big advantages that this camera had over my 350D is it has live view. So I used to shoot with the LCD. Now, when I shot with this, because I was using the viewfinder, I used to really struggle to identify distractions around the edges of the frame. But when I'm shooting with this, it became so much easier for me. And so I think this is the first time when a piece of technology really helped me to improve my photography. Now, it wasn't just my camera that I wanted to simplify, I also wanted to simplify my post-processing. And before, I was using a laptop and I was using a RAW processor that comes with the Canon software. I think it's Digital Photo Professional. And then I was finishing the images off in Photoshop Elements, I think it was. And so I did away with all that and I just started to edit my images on the iPad. And at the time, the iPad didn't have a very good RAW converter, so I was forced to shoot in JPEG. And that meant that I had to be very, very careful about my exposure. I had to try and get that exposure as balanced as I possibly could because I wouldn't be able to do as much correction as if I had been shooting in RAW. So that helped me to make sure that I was getting my exposures right in camera all the time. And another huge advantage of shooting with this is it had a live view histogram. And so I knew whereabouts my exposure was, whether I was going to be underexposing or overexposing. So again, this camera really helped me out there to understand better how to expose my images. By this time, we'd bought our house in the Lake District and we were spending weekends here. And we were still working in Scotland, but at the weekends I was able to get out into the Lake District, explore the area. And it was shooting in a very, very different style to how I shoot now. Rather than going out to take photographs, I was going out, enjoying myself, enjoying the Lake District and the countryside, and using this little camera to document my time outside. And as I say, that was a very, very different approach to the photography to the one that I have today. Eventually, my passion for photography started to grow, and I started to go out more and more to take photographs. I think because my photography was improving and I was getting better at it, I was enjoying it more, and therefore I wanted to do more and more of it. And eventually, although this camera was absolutely fantastic, I did make the decision that I thought it was probably time to invest in a better camera. In November 2015, I bought this. This is my Canon EOS 6D. It's a full frame, 20 megapixel DSLR, and it has on it a 24 to 70mm f4L lens, which is the lens that I bought with this camera. And I absolutely love this camera. This is the camera that I still use today for landscape photography, even though it's nearly 5 years old. And around this time I started to take my photography a lot more seriously. I was going out specifically to take photographs, and I was doing a lot of research into locations that I thought would allow me to get good images. And it was also at that time that I started to use a tripod again, and I also started to invest heavily in high quality filters. Now around this time I was trying to learn as much about photography as I possibly could, specifically landscape photography, and my learning curve was like that, very steep. I spent an awful lot of time reading books and reading online articles, and eventually I found my way onto YouTube. And on YouTube there were a bunch of guys, and it was very few guys back in those days, who were going out into the landscape with their cameras and sharing their passion and their knowledge for photography. And this was really my first introduction to YouTube. Beforehand, I didn't really watch YouTube. I had no idea what it was there for, really. I thought it was just somewhere to host funny cat videos. I started my YouTube channel in May 2017, and I thought at that time that I knew quite a lot about photography. Turns out that was complete nonsense. One of the misconceptions that I had made was that I should only shoot when conditions were perfect, otherwise I wouldn't get good images. But now that I had a YouTube channel and I wanted to create videos, I had to go out every Saturday morning. Saturday was the only time I could shoot, regardless of what the conditions were. And invariably they would be overcast and drizzly and windy, and the sort of conditions that I would never shoot in. But over time I actually found that those conditions suited my photography better, and I was getting better images than I would when I was used to shoot in what I would consider ideal conditions. I should be honest with you, at the beginning of my channel I wasn't a particularly good photographer, but I did get lucky with the conditions, and there are some images that feature in some of my very early videos that are still in my portfolio today. I haven't actually sold any. If I ever do a video about images that sell, don't watch it, because clearly I have no idea about that. Before I started YouTube, I was struggling to get anybody to be interested in my photography at all. Tried all different forms of social media and nobody really took any notice. But when I started YouTube, I started to get a bit more attention, and I started to get people being nice about me, but more importantly about my photographs, even though at the time they weren't particularly special. And that gave me a huge amount of confidence. And that confidence encouraged me to go on and do more and more photography and keep practicing and keep practicing and keep practicing. So that was another huge benefit of having a YouTube channel, was that support that I got from the people that watched my videos in those early days, and the confidence that that brought in me to try and be an even better photographer. Now, originally when I first started to shoot in the style that you know me for now, when I first bought my 6D, as I said, my learning curve was like that. It was really, really steep. But inevitably over time, that curve started to flatten. And I did get to the point where I didn't feel that I was learning a great deal. Whether or not I was stuck in a rut because I wasn't always able to get the conditions that I wanted, or whether YouTube was distracting me, or whatever it might be, I started to level off. And it was at that time that I made the decision that I wanted to leave my job and try and go full-time as a landscape photographer, mostly to be able to dedicate more time to my photography. I went full-time as a landscape photographer in September 2019, and I don't think that my skills as a photographer necessarily improved all that much in those early days. I was much more focused on setting up the business. But one thing is true, is that I started to get more images that I thought were good. Now, when I've been preparing for this video, I've been trying to put together 10 images from the periods throughout my journey, and I struggled with all of them except for the most recent. And the reason for that is that I now have much more opportunity to get out and take photos, and therefore I'm able to get out and get the conditions that I need in order to create the images that I want to. Along my journey, I think there have been two really key decisions that have helped me get to the point where I am now. The first one is relocating from the south of the country up to the north. If you want to be a landscape photographer that runs workshops and one-to-ones, it really helps to be based in one of our fantastic national parks. And for me, the Lake District is the best place to do that here in England at the very least. The second thing is making that decision to go full-time, backing myself and my own abilities, and giving myself the time to dedicate to my photography and help me to improve, to go from being an enthusiastic amateur to at least a semi-competent full-time professional. And I think that those two decisions are massively underestimated in the importance that they've had on my journey. And I don't think that my critics give me enough credit for the bravery of those two decisions. That brings us up to the present day, which is in lockdown during the coronavirus crisis. And that means that my photography is being limited to when I can get out and exercise. And what I'm doing is I'm taking this Canon M50, which is the camera that I would normally shoot my videos on. It's a little mirrorless camera, and I'm using this to document my time out while I'm exercising it, and in that respect it's very, very similar to the period when I was using this little compact camera. And so coronavirus is enforcing another change into the way I approach my photography. At this stage, I do not know what impact coronavirus is going to have on me as a photographer in the long run. Certainly it isn't going to change my approach completely. I will still go out at times and use my big heavy DSLR on a tripod using filters in the same way as I have done for the last 5 years, but I do think it's time for a bit of a change in some of my photography at very least. I think I want to be a little bit more spontaneous, and I want to see if that will help me to find compositions that I wouldn't normally see and be a little bit more creative. Now, I have no idea where my photography journey is going to take me next, but I think it's going to be really exciting to find out.